Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we are very pleased to have Terry Whalin with us this morning. He is the editor and author of over 60 books, has written for more than 50 magazines. He is a former editor of Decision, the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association's magazine. Terry and his wife live in Colorado. He has written Billy Graham, a biography of America's greatest evangelist. Terry Whalin, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
Rabbi Walker, wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you. We have a good friend in common, Mr. Atchison.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Wayne Atchison. I haven't thought about Wayne in a while, but yeah, he's great.
Yep, I was actually up at the Billy Graham Library with him last year. We took a couple of busloads of people from Birmingham up to the library, spent a great deal of time up there with him, got a personal guided tour, and I strongly encourage everyone to take that journey. Well, Terry, you have quite a fascinating background in the fact that you have been a prolific author. What are some of the titles that you've written that we might be familiar with?
Well, I wrote a diet book years ago called First Place by Carol Lewis. I've written a couple books with Bishop Philip Porter, the leading African American in Promise Keepers. I've written biographies on people like Chuck Colson, Luis Palau, John Perkins, Sojourner Truth, Samuel Morris, a number of those kind of people over the years.
So you've been kind of drawn to writing biographies?
I have. When I was a kid, I read a lot of biographies, and they always fascinated me with the stories of other people, and so I've kind of translated that into a lot of my writing life.
So what was, going back to your youth, what biography really impressed you the most?
You know, we just finished President's Day here, Rabbi, and so I was thinking about, I read a lot of presidential biographies about George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Thomas Jefferson and all of our forefathers, particularly growing up. But then I branched out. I remember reading about Booker T. Washington and all different kinds of people. They were yellow, red biographies that I checked out of the library as a kid and read stacks of those.
And what part of the country did you grow up in?
I spent the first 12 years in Kentucky, in northeastern Kentucky. Actually, that's where a lot of my family's from. Then went to high school and college in Indiana.
Okay. And when you came out of school, what were your thoughts about college? What was your career path that you had envisioned for yourself?
I thought I was going to be a newspaper journalist, is what I trained for at Indiana University. But then I came to Christ about halfway through my sophomore year in college, and made a different life choice. I joined Wycliffe Bible Translators out of college, and actually spent 10 years in linguistics. Several of those in Guatemala, Central America, working among the Southwest Kachikel people. And so I spent 17 years with Wycliffe, and then I kind of returned to my writing and started writing for magazines. And my first book was published in 1992. So I've been in publishing a long time now at this point.
The translation field. I know language is very challenging. Language was very challenging for me because I grew up in a Jewish home where there were a lot of languages circulating around, especially Yiddish and different Eastern European languages. But
yes.
You wound up in. Were you trained in language? Were you bilingual?
Well, no, I was. That's part of the Wycliffe experiences. I was trained in linguistics. I spent 3 summers learning all the different things about linguistics, phonetics, grammar, those kinds of things, and then ultimately use those skills in Guatemala when I was working with the Mayan language. Absolutely.
Were there any major discoveries that you came across in the Mayan language that were shocking to you?
Not the shocking particularly. I just really realized that every person in the world really deserves and needs to have the scriptures in their own language. So that's what we were working to do there in Guatemala. We actually trained some nationals that finished the translation in 1992. So the New Testament is available in Southwest Cachiquel now, and so we kind of wrapped up our work there in Guatemala years ago.
Gotcha. What was the first biography that you wrote?
The first one I think I did. I think I did a biography of Sojourner Truth, who was a historical African American figure in the 1700s. Was the first one that I did, basically through research to put that book together. But I really enjoyed writing about Chuck Colson. I did a youth book about Chuck's life, starting prison fellowship and all those things that he did.
Did you get to meet a lot of these people, or was it after their passing?
I did. I spent a day in Luis Palau's home in Portland, Oregon, and I've met Chuck a number of times, interviewed all of his children, his wife Patty, and different people. So yes, very much as if they're if somebody that's living, I've met them as I worked on their biography. Yes.
So are these authorized biographies?
No, it's really a good question. My Billy Graham book is an unauthorized version of the book. I did work for the association about 23 years ago. I was associate editor at Decision, so I did check all the content of my book with the association before we published it. So, in my mind, it's as close to being an authorized, unauthorized kind of biography as you can get. It's accurate, but it's not. Doesn't have the official premiere of the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association.
Gotcha. Every biographer has a particular angle or particular focal point that is kind of common throughout their biographies. What's yours?
I've always been fascinated by people's stories and the way that they got to where they ended up. I think that journey is always a fascinating part of the biography in order to be able to capture. So, for example, for somebody like Billy Graham, people forget the fact that he grew up on a dairy farm in Charlotte, North Carolina. I mean, that experience of getting up at 2:30 in the morning to milk the cows, had to build something very hardy, I guess I would say, into his life and stamina as a person growing up. So those kind of details always fascinate me about how somebody's life really comes together and gets to where they're going.
Anything that you were able to uncover through your various biographies that was either so highly unusual or even shocking to you that it was something that became part of your anecdotal repertoire when you talked about the biographies you had written?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head here, but every single individual I find I work with has some unusual story that they're going to tell me about, either how they came to Christ or how they got into the ministry that they're in or something like that. So I kind of dig it up with each person individually, I guess is what I'd say.
I got you. When you decide on a particular subject, a particular person, what are the factors? What's the criteria you use in choosing who you write a biography about?
It comes in different ways. A number of the different ones that I've written over the years, the publisher knows that I'm one of these storytelling people that writes profiles and writes stories about people. So they've they've come to me and they said, we have this series going on and we need this biography. Are you interested in doing that? And my stance over the years has always been, if the door opens up and I can march through it, I do that. And
right.
So I pretty much said yes all the time to these different opportunities along the way.
Interesting. Are all of your subjects people of faith?
In general, they are. I've done some general market kinds of things, but I'd say the bulk of the books that I've written over the years have been for Christian publishers, Zondervan, Tyndale, Broadman and Holman, Moody, Cook, all those different companies I've worked for over the years.
So are you in the Hall of Fame, millions upon millions of books sold?
No, I'm not. I'm not one of these people that's in the Hall of Fame. I'm really more of a working journeyman writer, I guess I would say. Some of my books have sold a lot of copies, but in most of those cases, I was working for the publisher, so I got paid a fee rather than making money on each book that was sold per se. So several of my books have sold a lot of copies, but it's just kind of the way it turned out. It wasn't anything that I orchestrated.
Gotcha. Now you're married?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. I've been married to Christine for 21. Well, it's going to be 22 years this year, actually. So.
All right. And how does she like? Do you write from home?
I do. I write from home, and yeah, she's been very, very supportive throughout this whole process. It's been amazing.
That's great. Any children?
We do. We have kind of his and hers. She had 4, and I have 2, and we have 13 grandchildren, actually.
Wow.
So, yeah, I have a lot going on the family side.
Now, is almost all your writing in the genre of biographies, or do you get involved in family, anything about your life or your children or your families?
I've done some writing how-to books, but I've also co-authored a number of books with different people. They're more how-to, self-help books that I've done with people. Like I did a diet book with Carol Lewis, for example, that I wrote called First Place. It's still out there. It's a foundational book for that ministry that started in First Baptist Houston. You're in Birmingham there, Rabbi. So I did a book in Birmingham a while back, actually, with one of your local well-known celebrities, Vanetta Flowers. She's the first African American ever to win a gold medal in the Winter Olympics. She won it in the 2002 bobsled in Salt Lake City, and so I actually wrote her book called Running on Ice that New Hope Publishers there in Birmingham published. And it's the story of how somebody from Birmingham could become one of the #1 bobsledders in the world. So, yeah. Interesting.
Did you get to spend much time here?
I did. I actually spent several a week or two with Vanetta and her husband Johnny, getting stories about what it was like to grow up in Birmingham and then suddenly become one of the top bobsledding people in the world. So it was a very different book. I had to go to Park City. I rode the sled for that book. All those kinds of things. Just did it once. I'm not going to write it again. Just did it once.
Right. Now, when you worked for the Billy Graham Foundation, what was your role there?
At the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, I was the associate editor of Decision Magazine. The magazine was based in Minneapolis, Minnesota back then, and we were doing 1.8 million copies of the magazine every month. It was quite an incredible operation there that we were doing. Now the magazine, since Franklin Graham's taken it over, has been moved to Charlotte, North Carolina there. And that's where it all comes from. It's still pretty large. I think the circulation of the magazine's around 300,000 now, but back when I was doing it, it was 1.8 million. Yeah.
when you were doing the research for this particular book, Billy Graham, having worked in the organization, did you get an opportunity to spend much time with him?
I did not get. I wasn't able to spend time with Mr. Graham, but I did. I interviewed his only living sibling, Gene Ford, who's there in Charlotte. His brother-in-law, Dr. Leighton Ford. I also interviewed him, and then several other people that I interviewed in the process of putting this book together to get some original stories that aren't anywhere else.
That's great. Was there any pushback when the book came out from the association? No
pushback from them, because they know that I would write it's all positive things about Mr. Graham. There's nothing racy or anything that unexpected that you find in there, and you never find anything racy about somebody with great integrity like Billy Graham. That's for sure.
Of course not. Of course not. Of all the people that you wrote about, where would he fall on that scale of your favorite, or the most interesting, or the most moving, motivating, compelling story that you've written?
Yeah, I would think Mr. Graham would be right there at the top of the biographies that I've written about. I mean, nobody has preached the gospel face to face more than he's done it more than anybody else on the planet. So he's a remarkable example as far as his integrity and his commitment to Christ and the gospel. It was an amazing opportunity to put this book together, that's for sure.
Did you have any issues? It's not a long book. It spans a period of, 50 plus years, but yet you've been able to condense it to a fairly quick read.
Yeah, that was the idea behind it. Actually, I wrote an earlier version of this book, the Bethany House published as part of their Men of Faith series years ago. And I put that book together, but unfortunately, that book is long out of print. And, Mr. Graham is not in real great health these days. Of course, he is 98 years old.
Right.
And so I realized that whenever Mr. Graham does pass, I'm going to be doing a lot of media and press because of my connection to him. And I selfishly thought to myself, this is going to be a bad deal for Terry Whalin whenever this happens, because I don't even have a book about Mr. Graham in the bookstore. But I thought, well, I work for a New York publishing house now, Morgan James Publishing, and so I thought we could fix this. So I didn't even have the type for the book, so we had to key the book in and completely reworked my old book from being, because back then they were in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now they're based in Charlotte.
Right.
So I had to completely update all the material in the book. And years ago I didn't get a forward. This time I got a forward by Luis Blau. I got endorsements by different people. Built a website. So I was really able to do my book in a much better kind of right way as opposed to how I did it years ago.
So is this a dusting off of an old, or is it brought up to date?
It's I completely brought it up to date. I added a lot of new stories. It's a complete rework of my old book, but at least it's back out there in the bookstore is the way I look at it.
Good, and you've got it all the way through Barack Hussein Obama, so it's as contemporary as it could be.
Yes, absolutely.
We're talking with Terry Whalin, prolific biographer, who has penned Billy Graham, a biography of America's greatest evangelist. Over the years, I think more people have been influenced by Billy Graham than possibly any other individual in preaching the gospel through radio, television, movies. the Billy Graham Library, which is just up the road from here in Charlotte, North Carolina. The story of his life is a simple story. It is one that is not of peaks and valleys. He was introduced and prayed for leaders of many nations and many, many presidents. But more than anything else, he remained a man who was humble, who believed that his calling to serve the Lord was more important than fame, fortune, or really expensive clothing. And he made that very clear in the various interviews that he did. But this book by Terry Whalin captures a little bit different side of Billy Graham. Talks a little bit about him being a practical joker, addresses some of the issues of growing up in a segregated South, some unique perspectives that you might not get anywhere else. And when we return from break, we're going to get back together with Terry Whalin, talk about this book, Billy Graham, a biography of America's greatest evangelist. While we're on break, go visit the books and media section of ignitinganation.com and order this book and read about one of America's greatest evangelists. We'll be right back. This is the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of Revealing the Truth, right here on the Igniting a Nation Broadcasting Network, inviting you to join me every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for our Prophecy in the News classes. Each week I take the headlines from around the world that have a biblical connection and present them in a way that brings the news and the Bible to life. There are over 2,500 prophecies in the Bible, and there are so few classes available to see how they connect with world events. We cover everything from Islamic terrorism to the changing relationships between Russia, Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Israel. Prophecy is unfolding before our very eyes, and to many, it is complicated and hard to understand. In just 1 hour each week, you'll be given the tools and the biblical connection to world events. With so much going on and so few reliable sources of news, I encourage you to join me every Monday night at 7 o'clock p.m. at St. Mark United Methodist Church in Northport, every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. at Beechwood Baptist Church in Mount Olive, and every Thursday night at 7 p.m. at Mountain Chapel United Methodist Church in Vestavia. If you want to make sense out of what's happened in the world around you, this is the class for you. All are welcome. Times and location addresses can be found on our website at ianbn.com. I hope to see you there. Shalom. Shalom and welcome back to Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heart lines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Terry Whalin today about Billy Graham, a biography of America's greatest evangelist. Welcome back to the program, Terry.
Great to be with you, Rabbi.
Thank you. You know, you take us on a journey through Billy Graham's life, but there were some struggles that he went through early on that kind of forged who he would be for the rest of his life. What were some of those challenges and struggles?
Yeah, well, I think just his environment of growing up on a dairy farm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and like I was saying earlier, getting up at 2:30 in the morning to have to milk cows, that kind of forges something into your character when that big alarm clock rings at the foot of your bed and says, 2:30 in the morning to get up and go out and do that. I think he learned a lot of really great lessons, even as a child, being asked to do that as part of his family.
When you did the research in his background, you took a look at his childhood and some characteristics of him being what he was like as a kid. How would you describe him?
Mr. Graham was always interested in sports. He played a lot of baseball. He got the love of history from his mother, reading books, that kind of thing. He wasn't really a great student in school, I'd say, but he was well liked among his classmates and such. When he was going to school, he used to like to to play out in the woods and he had a Tarzan yell, and they say that may have helped him develop the vocal cords that he had later on when he was preaching and that kind of thing.
Well, you kind of portray him as a practical joker. What was it you discovered about him that made you come to that conclusion?
Well, it was kind of a different side of him that I learned. People told me stories. Back then, Billy would ride the school bus to get to school, and the school bus had a crank, kind of where you could reach out, get out of the bus and get underneath it and hit this crank, and it would knock off the gas to the engine. So he would make a big show of getting out of the bus when they arrived there, wave to the bus real big, and then, but in that process, he would hit that crank, and so the driver would roar off, but it would only get so far until it sputtered to a stop. So that was a common thing that Billy would do as a practical joke.
It's kind of a funny picture that sure was very entertaining for all the rest of the children.
Yes.
You know, people look at him as a man of the Word, completely, radically, 100% sold out for the gospel message, the inerrancy and the power and the transforming power of the Word of God. But it wasn't always like that for him, was it?
No, Mr. Graham had to come to his understanding and his faith in Jesus. Just kind of the journey that all of us have to take, and to really trust the Scriptures. He did have a dark night of the soul. Basically, after he graduated from Bible school and everything, he was actually one of the youngest Bible college presidents in the country at Northwestern University, based in Minneapolis, which is why the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association started there in Minneapolis. Everybody wonders, why were they in Minneapolis? Well, that's where he was back then as a president of a Bible college. And he was invited to the Forest Home Conference out in California to speak, one of the youngest Bible college presidents that was there. And that night, after he spoke, he went out into the forest, found a stump with his Bible and got down on his knees. And, he really prayed. He said, God, there's some really different stories in the Bible when I read the Bible that are there. But, I'm going to take every word in this Bible, cover to cover, as being your truth. And I'm just going to accept it by faith. And so he really made a key decision, I think, in his life and in his career when he prayed that prayer. And he never turned back from that. He just continued on in the life of faith after that experience.
Well, and that is exactly what should happen to each and every one of us. Now, you talk in the book about him almost dying in an airplane crash.
Yeah, you can imagine as many plane crashes or as many plane trips, rather, as somebody like Billy Graham has taken over the years. There's got to be at least one near plane crash kind of story, and there was one. One of the ways he got started in his whole evangelistic ministry was speaking at Youth for Christ rallies around the country, and so he was traveling over the Canadian Rockies, actually in a small plane. It was snowing. It was late at night. He was like the only person on the plane that was awake, other than the flight attendants and the pilot. And they came through and they told him that they were really struggling. They were running out of fuel and they were going to have to land somewhere unexpectedly. So they got everybody up. They got everybody prepared for a rough landing, and did finally land the plane in this little town there in Canada, and checked them into a hotel. Well, it turns out the room that they put Billy Graham in had actually been there had been a robber that had been there earlier that evening, and so that night there was a knock on the door, and Mr. Graham roused it out of bed and opened it up, and there was a Canadian Mountie standing there, ready to arrest whoever was in this room, because supposedly it was a robber that was there. And Mr. Graham had to get the airline people out up to vouch for him that he was not the robber, and so he didn't get arrested out of it. But it sure made for kind of a harrowing experience for this young evangelist out traveling in Canada.
I'm sure of that. You know, he knew many presidents, didn't he?
He did. Mr. Graham actually started with Dwight Eisenhower. He knew General Eisenhower when he was the Supreme Commander of the forces at the end of World War II, but then he knew him after he became president. And so, yes, he's known every single president from Dwight Eisenhower all the way through Barack Obama, actually, President Obama. And it was actually through his meeting with Dwight Eisenhower and his conversation with him that he suggested to Dwight Eisenhower that they have a presidential prayer breakfast, and that the president actually come to that prayer breakfast. And that's something that just happened a few weeks ago here with President Trump going to that prayer breakfast. But that's a tradition that actually Billy Graham started with Dwight Eisenhower many years ago. Mr. Graham spoke at the first few of those presidential prayer breakfasts, and it's a tradition that carries through today, actually.
Interesting. We're talking with author Terry Whalin, author of a biography of America's greatest evangelist, Billy Graham. This is a version of Billy Graham side that we have not readily seen. As Billy's years advance, we want to know more about him. We want to study his life a little bit closer, and Terry Whalin, you've done a great job of doing that for us, and we very much appreciate you sharing that with us today here on Revealing the Truth. So Terry, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for sharing the book. We strongly recommend it to our audience and hope that you will continue to speak out. I'm sure that people are well aware of his failing health, and that almost at any day we'll be hearing of that report that he's passed on over. So Terry Whalin, thank you so much for being with us here on Revealing the Truth. It was a pleasure to meet you and a chance to read the book that you've written. Thank you so much.